One of the newest improvements and features for 3ds Max 2010 is the new review technology. Basically, they've revamped the viewport so much that you can actually use the viewport to get yourself real-time rendering of your scene using 3ds Max lighting and mental ray lighting. It's very well integrated with mental ray, and we're going to look at that in this video. And you're going to be pretty surprised because you probably haven't seen anything like it in most other 3D packages, and certainly not in versions of 3ds Max before this one. Okay, so let's look at some of those improvements in version 2010. I'm going to take this portal light that I created in the previous video, and I'm just going to delete it. So now I have myself my regular scene. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the grid on my scene. I'm simply going to do that by hitting G for grid on the keyboard, and there we go, the grid is gone. Now, here's our viewport. Right now in our viewport, what we see is very basic lighting and shading. Okay, we see the gray shader of these objects. We don't see any shadows. The light that we see is the default light of 3ds Max, which is basically like a light that's attached to the view. So when I move my camera around, there's always this default light that's all over the place. Now in 3ds Max 2010, we have the ability to create lights in our viewport and actually display shadows, lighting, even ambient occlusion, which is pretty awesome. And for the first time, soft shadows. So how do we do all of this? Well, before you can do any of this, there's a very important thing that you have to take into account. Very important here. You have to have good video hardware on your workstation. Okay? If you don't have good video hardware, for example, if you're using a system that uses, say, integrated graphics or the onboard graphics from your motherboard, you're probably not going to be capable of taking advantage of these great features of 3ds Max 2010. You have to make sure you have a good video card. So what's a good video card? Well, there's some good video cards out there, some good workstation cards. You can use an ATI Fire GL, you can use an NVIDIA Quadro FX video card. You can even use some NVIDIA gamer cards that I've found to work very good, and they're actually pretty inexpensive. Okay, to find out if your system is capable of taking advantage of this real-time viewport technology in 3ds Max 2010, it's actually pretty simple. You can come over here to Help, okay, and you can go down here to this menu item called Diagnose Video Hardware. This is the first thing you want to do. When we click on that, the Max Script Listener opens up, and it gives you basically a quick synopsis of your video card and what it's capable of. And it lets you know if the video card is capable of supporting some of these features of 3ds Max. Okay, so let's have a look at this very quick. Here is a review of the GPU feature support for my particular video card on this workstation. Okay, now this is a pretty good workstation. It's a dual quad-core Xeon, so it's an 8-core workstation. It's a server system designed for 3D graphics. And but my video card is not a super high-end and expensive Quadro FX video card that's, you know, $5,000, something like that. Instead, I have a simple NVIDIA GeForce 8800 GT. Now, there's this sort of stigma in the industry where there's a pretty huge debate between which video cards are good for doing 3D animation and which aren't. Now, there's a stereotype out there, basically a myth, that says that you have to have a high-end workstation graphics card. You know, one of those $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 video cards. That's simply not true. If you can afford one of those, or if you have the money to spend for it, or whatever, fine, go for it. But if you want to save yourself some money, and you don't want to go for one of those, but you still want to have the capability, practically, for one of those, you can actually go and get yourself a gamer card. In this case, I have myself here an 8800 GT, which sounds like it's not a good card, but honestly, it's a very good piece of hardware. Very good piece of hardware for a very low price. Okay, so here we go. My GPU, my graphics processing unit, supports Shader Model 3.0, which is this SM 3.0 here. Now, the viewports in 3ds Max support Shader Model 2.0 and 3.0, 3.0 being the best. Okay, if you want to be able to support all of the features of the real-time viewport rendering technology in Max 2010, you got to make sure you have a graphics card that supports Shader Model 3.0. Okay, So just be aware of that. Now, of course, this neat little utility here in 3ds Max lets you know which version of which shader model version your video card supports. In my case, it supports up to version 3, which means I'll be able to take full advantage of all the features of the Viewport rendering technology in 3ds Max 2010. You also get a few different stats here, like the maximum pixel shader instruction count, which is 4096 in my case, which is actually pretty good. Viewport shading quality for my video card supports the best, which is shader model 3.0. My video card also supports real-time sun and sky and real-time architectural materials. It's all supported. Okay, so in my case, what 3ds Max is saying is, look, I had a look at your video card. You have a pretty good video card, and you're going to be able to take advantage of my real-time viewport rendering technology features. Awesome. So I'll close that. If your video card doesn't support these features, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the features that I'm going to show you in this video. So just be aware of that. So before I can actually take advantage of these features, I need some lights in my viewport. So let's go ahead and create some lights. I'm going to go to the Create menu. I'll go to Lights. I'm going to go to Standard Lights here, and maybe I'll create myself a mental ray area light. How about a spotlight, mental ray area spotlight? That'll work just fine. And I'll create one over here. Make it so it's aiming at the center of my scene here. Put it maybe up here like this. I'll go to the parameters, make sure shadows are turned on. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do a render. Okay, so here's what my render looks like. Pretty good. I got my shadows and everything in here. Alright, now what I'm going to do is take that same light and maybe I'll make a duplicate. So I'll use the Move tool, I'll hold down Shift and just drag out here to create a duplicate or a clone. Make sure it's a copy. I'll hit OK. Now for this copy, what I'm going to do is switch it from a spotlight to an omni light. Okay. And I'm going to make sure, I'm going to leave shadows on. I'm going to move this light over here. I'm going to go to its intensity and lower its multiplier to something like maybe 2, something like that. I'm going to render this out again. There it is. Now it's a little bit bright, so I'm going to knock down that multiplier to maybe 0.5. And maybe I'll change the color here and give it a sort of soft bluish color. So this is going to be sort of a fill light. Can't see it too well there in the render. I'm going to take this light here and I'm going to give it a sort of warm color. So let's make it a little bit yellow here. Give it a warmer color. Render that out. There we go. Now this omni light over here is not too visible in my viewport, which is not good. So let me increase that multiplier back to 1. It's got no decay, so let me actually turn on the inverse square decay. Render that out again. So you notice that I'm just setting up these lights and I'm using mental ray to render over and over again. So the point of real-time viewport rendering is the ability to actually render out these lights in the viewport in real time and get yourself a very, very close and accurate result, very similar to a final render. Okay, the purpose of that is to get your rendering done a lot faster, because if you can preview stuff in the viewport in real time, you don't have to sit here and hit render over and over and over again. So it saves a lot of time. So let's go ahead and see how we can do that. Now that I have some lights here in my scene, what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable hardware shading. I'm going to go up here to where it says Smooth plus Highlights in my viewport. I'm going to left click on that, and you're going to see a menu here called Lighting and Shadows. That'll open up a sub menu. Right now these are the default options. Basically everything is turned off except the Illuminate with Scene Lights option. You want to make sure Illuminate with Scene Lights is turned on. Okay. Next thing we want to do is we want to enable hardware shading, which the shortcut is Shift and F3 on the keyboard. I'm going to turn that on. Once I do that, now you see that I can actually see my light in my viewport. Editor, there was bird in the background, edit that out of the video. Start again, 3, 2, 1. So here's my light inside the viewport. Isn't that just awesome? Now if I do a render, the render and the viewport don't look exactly the same, but they look pretty similar. If you have a look at that, they look pretty similar. Look at that spotlight shape there. Look at the spotlight shape in my viewport. It looks extremely similar, but we can make this look even better. Let's go ahead and do a few other things here. Let's go back to that lighting and shadows menu, and now let's turn on shadows right here. So we'll turn on shadows, and I can see that there's shadows inside my viewport. Now if I zoom in here, the shadows look very blocky, don't look very great. So it's not a very accurate representation of the lights that I'm rendering out here with Mental Ray. But let me go back here. I'll go back to the lighting and shadows menu, and I'll go to configure. When I go to configure, it opens up the viewport configuration options for lighting and shadows, and I could change some options here. Now you can see down here in my global settings for the quality and hardware support, I have two options. I have the good option, which is shader model 2.0, which is pretty decent, pretty good. But then I have the best option, which is shader model 3.0. And this is the one that looks great. If I go to good and I hit OK, this is what it looks like. Looks pretty decent. Looks better than the default viewport that we've been using this whole time, but doesn't look that great. When I switch and I go back to my configure menu and I switch to best, you can see how good that looks. And if we do a render of this with Mental Ray, you notice that it looks pretty close to that. Have a look at that. Looks pretty close, but not exactly there. Well, let's see if we can change that. Let's go back to lighting and shadows. Let's go to configure. And this time over here on the right, you see this enable shadows option. Right here, the default setting is set to hard shadow. That's why we see these hard blocky shadows. Well, let's select the new option, 3ds Max 2010, the soft shadow option. And let's hit OK. Now we get ourselves some beautiful soft shadows inside of our viewport, which looks simply fantastic. If we do a render, doesn't look exactly like the render, but it looks pretty close. And this can help you to be able to visualize and see your scene in real time in the viewport. And I can actually move around here. The better your video card is, the better the frame rate's going to be when you swing around and look at this. Now if I create more and more of these lights that have shadows, my viewport's going to slow down by a lot. So if I take this light and I make a clone of it, okay, and this light's also projecting shadows, it's actually going to increase or decrease my frame rate here. Now in my case it's not, because this video card is so good. It's just an 8800 GT from NVIDIA, but you can see how good it is. It keeps up with the scene very, very well. Okay, so you don't need some super high-end $5,000 video card to be able to do stuff like this. Save yourself that money. Use it for something else, like making your mortgage payments or something like that. Okay, so here it is. Here's the real-time viewport rendering technology, but there's actually more. Let's go back here to the lighting and shadows. We have an extra option down here called Enable Ambient Occlusion. Okay, if we select that, we get this very nice ambient occlusion effect. Now it's a little bit difficult to see it, but it's there. And we can make it more apparent by configuring these options a little bit more. Let's go back here. Let's go to lighting and shadows. We'll go to configure. Okay. And up here on the shadow options, we have the enable ambient occlusion parameter, which we already turned on. We have quality parameters. We can knock down the quality of ambient occlusion to low. We can keep it at medium, which is default, or we can increase it to high. Let me go ahead and increase mine to high. Okay. It'll increase the look of the ambient occlusion effect, which you can see here, which is this sort of darkening right here, this nice soft sort of ambience right there. Okay, and it can help you to get a better look at your shadows, get a better look of your scene in the viewport in real time. Okay, you can see the camera viewport still running very, very well. Let's go back here. We can change the sampling radius for the ambient occlusion. Right now it's set to a default setting of 30. Well, if we increase this to say something like 100, now you can see we get a lot of ambient occlusion. Now we get ourselves way too much to the point where it just doesn't look right. So you want to be careful with that and not go too crazy with that option there. The default setting of 30 is actually pretty good. Okay. Now we can use a few different options here. We can tell our viewport to use the environment background color. So if we select this option here, we can go ahead and hit OK. And now our background is the same background from the environment and effects window. If we hit 8 on the keyboard, we can see here's our background color. Okay. If we change it to say something like blue and hit OK, just move our viewport around to update it. Now we get that blue color in the background here. Alright, so you have the option of doing that. One important thing to take note of is that right now this viewport technology doesn't support environment maps. So you can't just plug in an image here, like say come in here, plug in a checker map, it actually won't show up in the background, as you can see. So let me actually go back to here, clear this out, okay, and close this. Let me go back to my lighting and shadows and configure. Okay, now there's another option here that is actually pretty useful, and that is the exposure control. Right here we have this option that says enable exposure control in viewport. Let's hit OK. You can also select that option from here. You'll see this option says enable exposure control in viewport. When you select that on, we can actually see the exposure control settings inside of our viewport. Let's hit 8 on the keyboard to go to the environment effects tab here, and here's our exposure control. If you remember, we have this mental photographic exposure control. If we go to no exposure control, this is what it looks like without any exposure control. Looks pretty nasty, doesn't look too good. But we can actually go to MR photographic exposure control and see the exposure control inside of our scene the same way that we would when we do a full render like this with mental ray. Okay, so it's extremely useful, and we can come in here and we can change these settings around. For example, I can change the highlights on the burn, so I can increase that, and you see in the viewport it updates. Or I could decrease that. I can also increase my midtones, so you can see. I can also increase the shadows, so I can make the shadowy areas darker or lighter. I can also increase my color saturation here. And you can see now that the color in the viewport has become more saturated. There's a lot more color. And when I render this out with mental ray, I get pretty much the same result. Okay? So it's pretty awesome the way that you can actually view things inside of your viewport in real time using mental ray and 3ds Max 2010. So you can see mental ray lights, mental ray shadows, and even the mental ray photographic exposure control is supported by the real-time viewport rendering technology. Okay, so I hope you use that to your advantage. I strongly recommend that you do. If you're using Max 2010, why not? It's there for you. Take advantage of it. This is a feature that'll help anyone working with 3ds Max 2010 that needs to do any lighting and rendering work, but it's especially going to be useful for those of you working in the design visualization fields as well as architectural visualization. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. We're going to end this here, and we'll continue the next one and look at some more features and some different things about mental ray.